This video is in companion with a recent blog post, What You Need to Know About Zoom's New Security Features. So there were some existing security features, but unfortunately they were disabled by default, so most people who were hosting webinars or meetings had no idea they existed. So I want to first go over those. There are 3 that I want to discuss that existed and 3 that are new that I also want to cover. So if you're planning on hosting a webinar or meeting, either one, I'm going to use those synonymously in this video because these particular settings, it doesn't really matter which one you're hosting. I'll only talk about a little bit about why they might have a change in how you apply them, but otherwise, in essence, the settings are applied the same way. So some of the existing settings, the first one is join before host. So you can see that one is actually right here. Oh, first I logged into Zoom and I clicked on settings. So that's all I did. I'm just at the Zoom app, the Zoom website and in settings. If you try to open the Zoom application, which I could do for you really quick, and you go to settings, you're going to find something very, very, very different than what I'm doing. These are not, you're not going to have the same stuff that I'm talking about. So what you really want to do is log into the web portal and then look at your settings here. So now that I'm there, I want to, if I look at join before host, if this is enabled, that means that anybody who joins the meeting before you arrive, because you set a specific time, they can actually get in there and they could be doing whatever they wanted to. So the reason you don't want to do this is if you're sharing your meeting ID with a large group of people or people who you don't know, like say you're trying to present a product and you're trying to make a sale, get people's interest, get people leads into your pipeline. You're sharing with people you don't know, and they could join before you. And unfortunately, what's happening is people are connecting to Zoom meetings and they're not wanted participants or attendees, and they're sharing their screen and information and sounds and things like that that are inappropriate for every user. So the way you can control some of this is to, 1, disable the join before host. So I would pretty much recommend that for everybody. I don't know, I can't off the top of my head think of a reason why I would want to enable that, but so I would disable that feature. The second thing is to mute participants upon entry. This one, here we go. There's a lot of settings in here, so you'll see me scrolling around a little bit. This one I'm not as big a stickler on. It sort of depends on what type of, this is where the meeting versus webinar comes in, I would say. What type of presentation, what type of video communication you're doing. If I'm doing a meeting, I'm less likely to enable this because a meeting is typically going to be everyone participates. So people are going to be called on. If you're, say you're a teacher and you're actually doing in real life teaching and you're asking your students to reply back to you and give answers and things, you're going to want to let them speak. If you mute them, they can't talk. However, if the larger the group you have, and if you have people who are not going to be participating as far as verbally, I would actually disable this. So, or enable it, excuse me, enable it to mute them when they enter. So, this comes in handy when you have a one-way type webinar. Say you're doing a product update and it's really just a one-way communication. You would definitely enable this, and then this also will prompt you to either allow people to unmute themselves later or only be managed by the host. And so that happens during the meeting. So that is important too, because if you want to allow other people, say it isn't just like a normal meeting, you probably want to leave it that they can unmute themselves when they want to. If it is something where it's very one way and you're just sharing information and everyone else is just there to hear it, and potentially they could type in chat and you can answer questions, which you see this a lot with product reviews and people's sales calls, then you would say, I'm managing that as the host. And then that means you as the host have to actually manage that. So if you want to let somebody speak, like you have a co-host or somebody else who's you need to actually present part of the product, you need to either unmute them or make them a host so that they can, during which you can do during the meeting by clicking on their name and more and saying make host. Then that's how you would want to manage that. But most of the time, if you're going to mute people upon entry, you'll allow them to unmute later. And that's typical of most meetings. Most webinars, I would say probably the host would manage that because they don't want to allow people to speak and jump in while they're talking. The third thing that already existed was screen sharing, which I think, no, I did not. Wasn't sure if I already passed that or not. Screen sharing, here we go. So screen sharing is important because if you were having somebody do a presentation, they're sharing information, they're sharing statistics, graphs, anything that they need to share from their computer, then you want to allow them to be able to share the screen. And the way you do that is all participants. However, that may not make sense for you, and that is where people are joining meetings and sharing their screen and having inappropriate content being shared. So it probably makes sense to most of the time have this be the host only, depending upon your group. If you are sending your meeting information or your webinar information only to people that you know very well, to a closed group, not very many guests, it's mainly like, it might be like a small group of people who are assigned a specific task at a certain company, and they're like a committee working together. This is when all participants make sense, because the meeting information and invite is going to specific people who don't change, and you know who they are. That's when all participants makes more sense, because then that way they can share, like, they might just even be giving an update. Here's the progress I've made. Here was my assigned task and here's what I've done. That is going to be super helpful if they can share their screen. If this is more one way or one person is presenting, again, you'll want to leave it as host only. It's safer, and it will help prevent people from either accidentally even sharing. It could be done as an accident. They're sharing, they're not paying attention, and people get, it's hard to sit on these Zoom meetings all day, every day. Now that we're not in real life with people, I can admit that sometimes I get a little checked out during these meetings too, as much as I try not to. So it's easy to accidentally click something and share something. So the safer bet is to say host only. So those were features that already existed. Now I'm going to talk about three new features that Zoom rolled out. I think April 5th was the actual rollout date. So the first one I'm going to mention is called the waiting room. And let's see if I can scroll down and find it. Here we go. As you can see, there are many, many, many settings in here. I'm only touching on some of the biggies because this video would go on forever if I try to discuss all of these. So I do recommend you could roll through and look at these. This is partially why we're having some of the security problems we're having, is because a lot of the security features that were available, even though there weren't enough, but the ones that are available, people didn't know about because they were disabled by default and they didn't come check these settings. So this is kind of on you as a host to come in here and check and see what's available to you and make it work for you. So the waiting room is a huge boon to the security settings for Zoom. Basically what this means is kind of like the waiting room anywhere. Everybody knows what a waiting room is. It means that you're not actually where you're intended to go. You're like in this in-between area. So a waiting room means people can join, in essence, your meeting, but they're, instead of going right into the live meeting or the live webinar, they are diverted into a virtual waiting room. So until the host approves them, that's where they sit. This is a great way to weed out people. If you share your meeting ID and your meeting information very public, if you're throwing it out on Facebook like, hey, join my webinar, blah blah, this is probably what you want to use, because this is going to be how you weed out some people. And it's not going to be everybody, because if you're trying to go out to the public, you may not know everybody that's going to want to join your waiting room. But if you see something that looks sketchy, you can block it. So if you see somebody who, instead of saying, my name is Wendy and this is the company I work for, and I'm trying to join your webinar because it's related to hardware that, I as a tech person may resell to clients, I'm going to make sense for your webinar. But if I'm, XYZ user and, it doesn't really make sense, it doesn't add up, then the safe bet is to not allow that person to come in to the actual meeting. So the waiting room is how you do that. It pushes people into like a virtual place that's kind of like gives them sort of a seat, but they're not actually in the meeting yet. So it's sort of an in-between. As far as the end user, the result is pretty much the same. The process is fairly the same. They just don't end up dumping right into the active meeting. There's that small little process in between. If you're planning on having a webinar and you're going to incorporate the waiting room and you plan on having a lot of attendees, I would suggest creating a secondary host whose only responsibility it is to join people or deny them. Basically accept or deny them coming into the webinar. Because if you're trying to set up for the meeting, talk and run the meeting, engage with people joining the meeting, and also, admit or deny people into the meeting, you're going to find yourself really overwhelmed really quickly. So that one little word to the wise about kind of time management, right? We want to get to the point when we get into these webinars. I also want to point out really quickly that this little V right here, this little box with a V dot, it means that there's a specific version of the client that's required, at least a minimum version. Now those will vary. As you scroll up and down this, you'll see different versions that pop up when you say this. But these have to do with what supports these specific features. So keep that in mind. So that's the first new security setting. It's my personal favorite, which is why I mentioned it first. Another one is a bunch of passwords. So there's also, let me see if I can find where those are. A bunch of different passwords you can require. Here we go. Is that all of them? Yeah, here we go. Sorry, there are so many settings in here and I can't just click right to go right to them. So the passwords. So passwords are new. Before, everybody just had a meeting ID, and you emailed that out, or you could also email the link, and they made it very easy from the meeting, and users just click the link, boom, done. Or they would go to Zoom and they'd say join a meeting, and they would enter in the meeting ID, which is a nice short little few numbers. Now, if somebody goes to zoom.us, they click join a meeting and type in the meeting ID, they're also going to be prompted for a password unless you disable this. So by default, this is enabled now, this new password piece. You can disable that if you want to, like so for instance, I'm in a group and we meet every week on Zoom right now because we're not able to meet in person, and we were already meeting every week, and so instead of now requiring everybody to have a password when I was using a recurring meeting, which also allows you to use a recurring meeting ID, I didn't really want to change that up because I wanted it to be easy for people to join. I basically just didn't want it to be a hassle. We're already meeting, it's the same group of people each time, so I disabled that for that meeting. But if I were doing a new meeting, or if I was doing a webinar that was going to be widely published, I would probably require the password because that makes it a little bit more safe. So one of the things you could do is you can push out through social media the web meeting ID, but then make people sign in with you or connect with you to get the password. And that's one way you can control who is getting that information. Another way you can do it is using something like SurveyMonkey, where people, you've put out that you're having a webinar, you have people sign up, and then instead of putting the meeting ID all over social media or the internet or wherever you're posting it, they then have to fill out some information about themselves, and then they get emailed a response with that information. It's just one step further. Nothing's going to prevent everybody, everybody that's trying to get to a meeting who might not necessarily be an invited person from getting in. These are merely steps you can take that will increase the likelihood that you will prevent those people from getting connected. And again, the waiting room is the best way. You can kick somebody out when they've joined your meeting that's inappropriate, but if they have the credentials to join, they can just rejoin, and that's been a big part of the problem. So the waiting room is key because it prevents them from ever getting connected to the meeting at all. And so instead of trying to reactively kick somebody out of a meeting who takes over, you just prevent them from getting there at all. So passwords, there's a few different things here. So there's new meetings, there's also instant meetings, which is like right now. You require a password when you're using your personal meeting identification. So there's two ways when you're creating a meeting, and I'll show that in a minute, where you can use a randomly created ID or you can use your personal meeting ID. Either way, doesn't really matter. But if you require a password, you can do it for all meetings or just ones that are have the join before host enabled, which I don't recommend at all. So I just clicked all meetings for that. Embed password in meeting link for a one-click join. So this is one of the smart things to do if you're sending the links out to people who you've already verified. So that would be basically what this means is instead of users clicking a link and having to enter a password, the password's embedded in that link. So they click it and they get right into your meeting. So again, use that with caution. Use it with people people who have either registered or people that you're connected with already. You don't want it, that's not something you want to throw out on the internet. Or at least if you do, you're more likely to get people you don't want in your meeting. And last but not least is the security menu that's available during a webinar. So I'm actually going to create a webinar or a meeting just really quickly just to show you this. Schedule new meeting. And I'll show you what I'm talking about with that personal ID as well, meeting ID. So generate automatically or use your personal meeting ID. So that setting that we were just looking at that had the password and was specifically asking about passwords for personal meeting IDs, that's where this setting is. That's where you see that when you're creating a meeting. So these are the different things that you have available when you're actually creating a meeting. I'm just going to say save and start my meeting. Also, don't forget, this is where you can copy the invitation to send to people, and I'll click it just so you can see. So this is the meeting ID and here's the password. So you might want to send this piece out to people. Sorry, let me grab the whole thing. And then keep this behind if it's a widely spread thing out to the internet. And also this link, keep in mind, this has the password embedded. So if you share that with everybody, you've already given them the access. So you want to use that sparingly. You want to use it with people you know. Okay, so I'm going to start the meeting. So you can see the new security feature that's available in, it's actually a little menu available inside when you're in your meeting screen. So now you'll notice here, this was never available before. So when you're a host and you're hosting, normally, I'm not going to actually have anybody connect, so you can just see the information here. But when you're doing your meeting, this was never here before. So you have share screen, you had your managed participants, we've always had that. Just want to make sure you can see this. And also chat. I usually open both of these. And then as you're doing your meeting, the menu, as you saw, the menu disappears. But if you come back down here, security, this did not exist before. So from here, I could lock a meeting. So say I did accidentally end up, somebody shared something and they weren't supposed to. I end up with somebody that I don't want in my meeting. I can kick them off the meeting and then I can lock the meeting. Basically, nobody else can get in. And that is a great little feature because then I don't have to worry about people continually jumping into my meeting. So I don't have to cancel my meeting, start a new one, send everybody the information and get them to reconnect. Because what a hassle. I mean, if you're trying to share information with people or even sell a product, what are the odds that somebody's going to reconnect? They're not. Most likely, you're going to lose a lot of people. So you don't really want to do that. So you can also enable the waiting room or disable. These are all toggles on and off. You can, here you can tell I've disabled the share screen, so I could enable that. Chat, all these different things I can access from here. Now, not everything we discussed is available here. So the important thing to know is you can't change everything on the fly. That means you can't change everything once you're already in a meeting. So be really careful. I'm going to go ahead and close this just so you can go, so I can go back to the settings really quickly. You want to be really careful about how you set up your settings, because the way that you set them up, not everything in here is going to be available after you started your meeting. And the last thing you want to do is have to cancel a meeting to start over because for whatever reason there was something you didn't set up and now people can't do what they need to do, right? So those are the biggest security pieces that you probably need to be paying attention to if you're going to host a Zoom meeting or webinar. 3 of them are new, 3 of them already existed, but you really want to log into the web portal and go to settings because that's where you're going to access all these features.